Contested Bones, Part 7. We've been going through the book Contested Bones, written by Christopher Rupe and John Sanford. The book is available in various places, including sometimes Amazon, but also at the contestedbones.org, where you can find a little more about Christopher Rupe and John Sanford. The book itself looks like this. The two authors, Christopher Rupe is a young man who's doing research. John Sanford is kind of his mentor. The prologue of the book outlines John Sanford's travel, maybe I should say intellectual travel. John Sanford believed in evolution until around the age of 50, when he realized the impotence of evolution and the impact of genetic entropy. Between the two of them, they destroyed his belief in evolution and in fact destroyed his belief in long ages. And then he had cognitive dissonance with all the fossil evidence from man evolving from apes. And so he and Chris Rupe set out to investigate. Chapter 1 kind of sets the stage, discussing the advancing apes icon, the evolutionary story, the scientific method, and taxonomic principles. Chapter 2 gives the textbook of picture of evolution. Following Darwin's expectation is more or less of a straight line, with some branching, but largely the important part, getting from one species to another, is more or less straight line. The field is now widely acknowledged to be more bush-like, and some state that the ascent of man cannot be traced. Almost all the fossils are contested, as will be the ones in this chapter. Chapter 3 argues, I think, well, that Neanderthals are human. Chapter 4 argues that Homo erectus is human. Chapter 5 argues that Homo floresiensis is human as well. Chapter 5 argues that Australopithecus afarensis is in fact an ape. And we're now... how did I do that? Because we're in chapter 7, and it's Ardipithecus ramidus, the oldest human ancestor or extinct ape, is the question. And the quote that he has at the beginning is, "Where did Ardipithecus and the other early hominin contenders come from? Are they truly members of the hominin lineage, or simply apes among the tangled branches that constitute the basal hominin bush?" I'm not sure why he spelled hominin with an E, but whatever. The background and discovery of Ardi is then laid out. In the middle Awash River Valley of Aramis, Ethiopia, 46 miles away from where the remains of Lucy were discovered, fragmentary bones were found and attributed to a new putative species, Ardipithecus ramidus, referred to as Ardi hereafter. Paleo expert Tim White and his colleagues recovered approximately 45% of the skeleton. It consisted of broken portions of the skull, a jawbone, a full set of teeth, a few vertebral fragments, broken limb bones, and a crushed hip. Sounds great. Actually more complete in some ways than Lucy, although you'll notice that the spine is missing, the ribs are missing, shoulders are missing. In fact, the sacrum is largely missing too. There's, what is that, one thoracic vertebra maybe?
Paul, where are those other bones?
They were never found.
I know, but typically when something dies, are animals taking bones away, or would we expect them to dissolve?
Well, we're going to get to that in a little bit. Let's just say that I am not quite as confident as they are that what they have is in fact one animal even. These bones were sandwiched between volcanic ash layers that were dated using the argon-argon method to be 4.4 million years old. Missed a a mutation there. This is the same questionable method used to date Lucy. See chapters 6 and 12. According to the claims made through the popular press, Ardi is man's oldest known ape-like human ancestor. Based on Ardi's estimated age, it is viewed as the closest hominin species to the split that allegedly occurred between 6 and 10 million years ago. Interesting, the popular press usually uses 6 million. Headlines promoted Ardi as the discovery of the century, triumphing over the famous Lucy discovery in 1974, and that's a quote. The finding was said to call into question the long-held evolutionary assumption that humans evolved from a chimp-like ancestor. It would seem Ardi changed everything. Researchers said textbooks needed to be rewritten. Again. The discovery team claimed Ardi was a new kind of ancestor, not resembling a chimpanzee or a human. It is neither ape nor man, yet somehow reveals the surprising ancestry of both. But if Ardi did not look like a chimpanzee or any other type of living ape, what did it look like? And how could anyone be so sure that the poorly preserved remains belonged to an early ape-like human ancestor as opposed to just another extinct ape? Ardi was originally classified as being in the same genus as Lucy, Australopithecus. Later it was reclassified into its own genus, Ardipithecus. I guess you get extra points for that. Ardi's pitiful remains an artist's imagination. Ardi's bone fragments were discovered in 1992 in the Middle Awash region. A full analysis of the remains was not published until 17 years later in 2009. The reason why it took almost 2 decades for researchers to reconstruct the remains and present their findings to the public was because the pieces of bone were scattered over a very wide area, and virtually none of the bones or fragments were connected to each other. So, are they all part of the same animal, in fact? The bones were not only very incomplete, but were very poorly preserved. Many bones were crushed and were described as mush that crumbled at the slightest touch. Discovery team leader Tim White described Ardi's remains as roadkill. Although, of course, there were no roads back then, hopefully. Well, who knows? The pulverized chunks of bone were found eroding out of the hillside, exposed to the elements. Rain, weathering, and erosion, presumably for millions of years. No wonder they didn't hold up. Researchers were amazed the bones had not completely disintegrated. Maybe it wasn't millions of years, but whatever. Although the bones were incomplete and badly damaged, the researchers immediately assumed they had found the world's oldest human ancestor. Premature conclusions of this type reveal a treasure hunt mentality. The strong desire to discover a missing link no doubt clouded their ability to be objective. When White and colleagues first proclaimed to the world they had found the oldest human ancestor in 1994 in the journal Nature, the only available remains that could be studied at that time consisted primarily of teeth, plus a few broken pieces of the base of the skull, and some arm fragments. And there is what they had. They had a complete humerus, looks like, well, mostly complete, and ulna, and I'm not sure what that is, radius maybe, and then, and some teeth, and that's about it. And they're writing a paper on a whole new species on that basis. The researchers had no way of knowing for sure whether the loose teeth and bone fragments belonged to a single species, let alone a new species, and they had no direct evidence these bones were from an early precursor to man. White acknowledged that out of all the recovered remains, no skeletal parts were found articulated. That's in the article. The remains were completely disconnected and were scattered widely across the excavated area. How widely? The initial fragments were as far apart as 1 mile. And the subsequently recovered bone fragments were spread over a total distance of 4 miles. Your answer, I think, is there. Okay. The bones were so fragile that they could not generally be collected as found. Ardi's remains had to be hardened with a chemical bonding agent and transported to the lab before they could be digitally reconstructed. Basically, they did CT on them and then reconstructed a three-dimensional thing that they could manipulate. An accurate reconstruction of many of these scattered bone fragments into their original anatomical positions was physically impossible, with the exception of a few better preserved bones of the hand and feet. Interestingly, the hands and feet on this one were found, in contrast to Lucy, where the hands and feet are not found. What they came up with was a very apish-looking creature, but supposedly standing perfectly erect, with inferred hips and spine that were made to appear human. One of the most popular illustrations of Ardi is seen in the 2009 discovery paper published in Science, Figure 3, which we'll look at immediately. This bizarre interpretation of the bones was strategic to promoting the claim that Ardi was an early human ancestor that evolved not long after the alleged chimp-human lineage split some 6 million years ago. And there is Ardi in all her glory. It's supposed to be a female. Notice that all of that spine has been reconstructed. Pretty good reconstruction, I would say. And they put flesh on it. The image of Ardi reveals an overall ape-like anatomy, however. Its upright posture, lumbar lordosis, and mid-stride human gait give the misleading impression that Ardi was somehow more than an ape and was undergoing dramatic evolution to become human. To support this notion, the discovery team claimed Ardi had a mixture of ape and human traits. Wherever the skeleton was well preserved, it was clearly an ape, and all parties agreed. This included an ape-sized brain case between 300 and 350 cubic centimeters, overall ape-like body proportions with long upper limbs compared to lower limbs, long and curved fingers and toes typical of tree-dwelling primates, and ape-like feet with a highly divergent opposable great toe indistinguishable from a chimp's. And here is the drawing on the previous page of Ardi compared with an actual photograph of a female bonobo. And take a look at the feet. They almost look like hands. Look at the hands with short thumbs, short thumbs. Those are the well-preserved parts, remember. This is consistent with paleo experts who insist that Ardi is nothing more than an extinct ape. So what evidence suggested to the discovery team that Ardi was an early upright walking ancestor to man? The evidence is primarily the very poor reconstructions of certain features that made Ardi appear more human, namely the crushed skull, shattered hip, and teeth. We'll come back to those. These imaginative reconstructions, skull and hip, were used to justify the very questionable assumption that Ardi had an essentially human spine. However, many paleo experts did not agree with the discovery team's reconstruction of these poorly preserved bones. Skipping over a paragraph, Ardi's ape skull. A key piece of evidence presented by White et al. That Ardi walked upright was the inferred placement of the foramen magnum. Those of you who aren't in medicine or anatomy, foramen magnum simply means big hole. And we'll see a picture of that in a monkey in a little bit. This is the hole in the base of the skull that indicates the angle of the head-spine connection. It's where the spinal cord goes through. In many apes, the foramen magnum is positioned toward the rear of the skull. This allows the spine to project outward at an angle to create the characteristic bent hip, bent knee posture of apes. In humans, the foramen magnum is positioned directly under the base of the skull, which is conducive for standing and walking upright. This feature is traditionally believed to be indicative of habitual bipedal locomotion, walking on two legs like humans. It works for most apes. It does not work for some of the more primitive apes, and it doesn't work for monkeys. Ardi's skull was reconstructed to suggest a foramen magnum similar to the human position. On the surface, this may sound like a convincing piece of evidence, but there are problems with this interpretation. First, it is important to realize that the researchers were dealing with a skull that was broken into 100 pieces and severely crushed down to 4 centimeters in height. there's the skull. As you can see, there's just pieces that you can try to fit together. And what's even more interesting is that the foramen magnum doesn't appear to be part of those pieces. The remains were in such bad shape that they had to be digitally reconstructed using a CT scanner, then pieced together like a puzzle. Digital reconstructions are known to involve quite a bit of uncertainty and guesswork compared with physical reconstructions. But with those pieces, I'm not sure physical reconstructions are really that helpful. Evolutionary paleoanthropologist John Hawks acknowledged this writing. On the one hand, a model, referring to digital reconstruction process employed by the researchers, greatly facilitates the description and comparisons of the specimen with other key fossils. But on the other hand, any model comes with a load of assumptions which may not be explicit when anatomical comparisons are made. That's an understatement. Moreover, sizable portions of the skull were entirely absent. There was certainly a lot of leeway in deciding how the fragmentary remains were pieced together, including the placement of the foramen magnum. In their science report describing the anatomy of the skull, the researchers confessed that they had to make allowance for the post-mortem, or after death, damage of the fossils. The problem is, no one but the digital reconstruction artists know for sure just how much allowance was deemed permissible to the scientific process of reconstruction. There can be little doubt that interpreter bias played a significant role in assembly. It reportedly took thousands of hours to digitally reconstruct what remained of the skull, and it was not until the 11th reconstruction that the researchers were happy with the outcome. Keep putting it together till you get what you want. We don't know why the other 10 previous versions were not chosen to represent Ardi. Given the severely crushed and fragmentary nature of the skull, it seems that any version could have been just as valid as any other. Examination of the skull pieces, figures 5 and 6, which we'll see figure 6 next, suggests that the base of the skull is not even present. That's the part of the skull needed to locate the foramen magnum. And you can see, you know, you have the base of the skull here, but here, most of it is just gone. For the sake of argument, let's assume the anterior placement of the foramen magnum was accurate, or I would say the midpoint placement. Would it then be a convincing argument that Ardi was a bipedal hominin ancestor? World-renowned evolutionary paleo experts Bernard Wood and his colleague Terry Harrison adamantly disagreed with the analysis and rationale offered by the researchers regarding Ardi's skull. In the journal Nature, Wood and Harrison point out that gibbons and short-faced monkeys have a similarly placed foramen magnum, yet they don't stand erect and have nothing to do with human evolution. They explain that the placement of the foramen magnum at the base of the skull has more to do with features of the face and placement of the head than with upright posture and bipedal locomotion. They note that there is a lack of empirical evidence to clearly support a functionally based correlation between foramen magnum position and bipedalism. Consider the foramen magnum position of a newly discovered African monkey species, Runguicebus kipunji. It obviously does not denote bipedal locomotion and is certainly not evidence that it was our ancestor. You can see the foramen magnum. It's relatively anterior instead of being put back here. The monkey is not closer to us than a chimpanzee. This is not Ardi, this is the monkey, which is further down the chain if that's the case. A Nature News article summarizes Wood and Harrison's main points. But Wood and Harrison say, this interpretation may be too simplistic. The review notes, for instance, that gibbons have foramen magnum that are similarly placed, similar in placement to those of humans. Another example of convergence, sharing similar traits apart from common ancestry. That's a good definition. Maybe it's all convergence. In the case of gibbons, however, the more central placement of the whole is there to allow for different skull characteristics rather than a bent posture. For this reason, the author suggests that using the Foramen Magnum as a method for diagnosing bipedal behavior may be misleading. Well, it certainly, yeah, has been proved to be misleading in some cases. Regardless of the reconstructed shape of Artie's skull, there is no question that it is very ape-like. A side-by-side comparison with apes demonstrates this plainly. We saw that figure. Moreover, the size of the brain case, between 300 and 350 cubic centimeters, was admittedly similar to that of bonobos and female chimpanzees and smaller than that of Australopithecines. All things considered, excuse me, there is nothing about the skull that indicates that Artie was an ancestor to man. Artie's ape hip. The claim that Artie was an early upright walking ancestor to man largely rests upon the highly questionable digital reconstruction of the fragmentary hip bone. Anatomist Owen Lovejoy of Kent State University was given the role of digitally reconstructing Artie's crushed hip. Lovejoy is the same scientist responsible for reconstructing Lucy's hip. See Chapter 6. It is quite clear that Lovejoy digitally reconstructed the hip to look the way he imagined, to support the preconceived idea that Artie walked habitually upright like modern humans. In consideration of the severely crushed and distorted hip, Lovejoy could have reconstructed it to look any way he wanted. We're going to see that figure in just a minute. Like the skull, the hip had to be digitally reconstructed using a CT scanner and required just as much imagination. Leading evolutionary paleoanthropologists were skeptical of Lovejoy's analysis. In the Annual Review of Anthropology, Craig Sanford, evolutionary paleoanthropologist from the University of Southern California, note the creationist institution, lists numerous criticisms of the claim made regarding Artie, including the hip reconstruction. And there's your figure, and you can see it's broken into hundreds of pieces. How do they fit together? Have fun. But it's clearly more human than chimpanzee. I mean, you can see that obviously. The reconstruction by White et al. Of the Ardipithecus fossils as hominin, a human ancestor, although argued from a variety of morphological traits, ultimately rests on the imaging of the pelvis. As Lovejoy et al. Pointed out, the pelvic remains were so severely crushed that as many as 14 reconstructions via computer tomographic imaging were considered before deciding which morphology was most in line with other data. So you actually didn't do them for their own sake, you did them because of other data. That raises an interesting question. As Harrison and Wood and Harrison have pointed out, a substantial degree of speculation went into the final morphology of the pelvis reconstruction. Subtle changes in the reconstructive processes may have yielded a far more ape-like postcranial anatomy. Other paleo experts have been just as wary. William Jungers comments in an article in Archaeology magazine, that is the digital reconstruction of Artie's hip. That's really kind of a 3D Rorschach test if you ask me. I'm still not convinced that it's necessarily completely accurate. You know, it's interesting to think, if they're doing this based on digital reconstruction, maybe the bones themselves can't be distributed, but the digital reconstructions can be reproduced and sent to anybody around, and the process could be transparent. Carol Ward, evolutionary paleoanthropologist and anatomist at the University of Missouri, again notice the creationist institution, agrees. Artie's ape spine. Lovejoy et al. Also claimed Artie had a human-like spine. This is reported in Science. He, that is Lovejoy, also infers from the pelvis that her spine was long and curved like a human's rather than short and stiff like a chimpanzee's. These changes suggest to him that Ardipithecus ramidus has been bipedal, an upright walker, for a very long time. Based on this highly speculative reconstruction of the hip, Lovejoy assumed that Artie must have had a human-like lower spine curvature called lumbar lordosis. African apes lack lordosis. They have fewer lower vertebrae than humans, creating a stiff lower back hip orientation that forms the characteristic bent-kneed posture of modern apes. Humans have a longer, flexible lower spine that is curved inward under the hips to give us our upright posture. Skipping over another paragraph. In the Discovery video, Lovejoy explains that chimpanzees and gorillas have on average 3 or 4 lumbar vertebrae, but Ardi probably had 6, like modern humans. Actually, modern humans have 5. But I wonder, is that Rupe's and Sanford's error, or is that Lovejoy's error? I haven't actually looked at the Discovery video, so I can't say. But there is absolutely no evidence of this in the recovered bones. The lumbar vertebra is entirely missing, as Lovejoy and researchers acknowledge. Although most of her sacrum and lumbar vertebrae were not recovered, parts of both lateral halves of Ardi's pelvis were. So you're judging this all on the ilium, ischium, none of it on the sacrum. See, look, pelvis. We're just missing everything until we get to the thoracic vertebrae. We know it was upright because it had lumbar lordosis, because the pelvis was the right shape. I think that's the reasoning. John Hawkes objects as well. Wood and Harrison take issue with this loose assumption in their review paper published in Nature. Likewise, the claim that Ardipithecus ramidus was a facultative terrestrial biped, that is, living in trees and sometimes walking on the ground, is vitiated because it is based on highly speculative inferences about the presence of lumbar lordosis and on relatively few features of the pelvis and foot, many of which also occur in the arboreally adapted Oreopithecus, an extinct ape. Ardi's ape teeth. A major justification for the inclusion of Ardi in the human lineage has to do with the size and shape of its canine teeth. Humans have non-threatening, diamond-shaped canines distinct from the larger, sharper canines found in apes. For this reason, evolutionists typically regarded smaller, less intimidating canines to be a human trait. Since Ardi was found to have considerably smaller canines than most apes, it was used as evidence to support the assertion that it was our evolutionary ancestor. In their published paper in Science, the Ardi researchers conclude the Ardipithecus ramidus dental evidence suggests that this occurred as a consequence of selection for a less projecting and threatening male upper canine. National Geographic repeats this assertion. I skipped over, but this is human with a canine tooth that's kind of, larger than average, but and this is variable in humans, by the way. Ardipithecus, a little bit larger than human, but not huge. And then, of course, the chimpanzee, where it is pretty much huge. And because it rubs against these other teeth, it tends to stay sharp. Respected evolutionary paleoanthropologists reject this as a convincing argument for the proposed status of Ardi as an early human ancestor. Major reason for the rejection is that the same dental features have been found in other species of extinct apes that have nothing to do with human evolution. Sarmiento makes mention of this fact in a response paper published in Science. 14 of the 26 characteristics in Table 1, in 1, which is White et al., common to Ardipithecus and Australopithecus, are in the canine premolar complex. However, reliance on the canine premolar complex to diagnose hominids in the classic sense has misdiagnosed Miocene fossil apes. For example, that is Oreopithecus and Ramapithecus as early human ancestors, when nobody really believes that they are. Character polarity for this complex is not clear-cut, with many early hominids, especially females, often showing a human-like condition. And by the way, I think that this Ardipithecus wasn't supposed to be a female. Approximation to the human-like canine premolar complex, therefore, does not indicate that Ardipithecus is a hominid or ancestral to Australopithecus any more than it indicates that Oreopithecus and the orangutan-like females of Civipithecus, both of which also share a human-like premolar canine complex, are hominids or represent a descender-ancestor continuum. Now remember, this is a quote. This is not Rupe's and Sanford's opinion. That one got into the peer-reviewed literature, therefore it must be correct, of course. Wood and Harrison in Nature add to the list of other extinct apes understood to be outside the human lineage that share this feature. It is important to recognize that during the late Miocene, a number of Eurasian hominids, for example, Oreopithecus, Uranopithecus, and Gigantopithecus. Urano by Uranus is heaven, Uranus, if you didn't recognize it, and Gigantopithecus kind of speaks for itself. Also developed small canines in conjunction with reduced canine premolar honing, presumably as a result of parallel shifts in dietary behavior in response to changing ecological conditions. Thus, these changes are not, in fact, unique to hominins or human ancestors. Skipping over a little bit more, Ardy's ape hands and feet. Ardy is quite clearly an ordinary ape, very similar to the modern chimpanzee. We saw that figure before. Perhaps this is most clearly seen by examining Ardy's hands and feet. Among the remains that were recovered, the hands and feet were extremely well preserved compared to the rest of the skeleton. For this reason, the hands and feet were the most informative bones in identifying what Ardy was and how it moved around. You can tell what they actually were, as opposed to the skull where you can reconstruct it any way you like. And there's figure 4 again. Notice that the hands and the feet are ape hands and feet. White, Lovejoy, and colleagues make note of this in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Her, that is Ardy's, hands and feet are extraordinarily preserved. Less well preserved, but nevertheless nearly complete elements of the teeth, skull, arms, and legs and pelvis provide further informative anatomy. That's them talking. It is interesting that the researchers build their case that Ardy was an early human ancestor almost entirely on those less well-preserved bones, predominantly the severely crushed skull and hip. On the other hand, the extraordinarily preserved bones clearly resemble those of living African apes. Ardy's feet display a highly divergent, grasping toe, exactly like modern tree-dwelling apes such as chimpanzees. Even Tim White, I'm skipping over a little bit, couldn't help but notice the specimen's large grasping toe, figure 10, which we'll see. He notes it really doesn't differ from apes, and that's the surprising thing. It is fully ape-like. Why is it surprising? Because he thinks it's a human ape ancestor, and it must be partly human. It is for this reason, among others, that William Jungers, an anatomist at Stony Brook University, highly doubts Ardy had a form of locomotion any different from that of living apes. And there's the bones, there's a reconstruction, and of course you can see the chimpanzee has a nice little grasping big toe, and of course ours tend to lie next to the other toes. Of course, White and colleagues don't see it this way. Instead of climbing in the trees like an ordinary ape, Ardy is pictured in their 2009 Science article as walking along the forest floor using the opposable great toe to balance on fallen tree limbs. The way Ardy is envisioned is bizarre and reckless speculation. The idea of a chimp-like creature using its chimp-like feet to climb along branches lying on the ground is quite humorous. The fossil evidence in no way indicates such behavior, nor does common sense allow it. And there's Ardy walking along the ground, and it happens to have a tree branch next to it, so it grabs it. Well, it must have walked along the ground because we reconstructed the pelvis to look that way. Ardy's hands are also unmistakably ape-like. They are extremely long and curved with short thumbs relative to the other 4 fingers, a characteristic of all living tree-dwelling apes. Sergio Almasiha and colleagues in Nature affirmed this, stating, Ardipithecus ramidus thumb within the gorilla hylobatid range, implying limits to its precision grasping capabilities. The morphology of the hand overlaps with those of gorillas and gibbons and is perfectly suited for limb grasping. Despite the obvious ape-like anatomy of the hand, White and colleagues still did their best to make RD into a new kind of ancestor. One of the key differences between RD and modern apes listed by Lovejoy and colleagues is the absence of the locking wrists that afford quadrupedal apes the ability to bear weight on their knuckles like chimps and gorillas. This was cited as evidence that RD was not like any living ape, but nevertheless the surprising ancestor of both humans and chimpanzees. Yet just because RD did not have knuckle-locking wrists, typical of chimpanzees, it does not follow that it was an early human ancestor. Most primates are not stiff-wristed knuckle walkers. Baboons and monkeys walk on their palms, a type of locomotion referred to as palmograde quadrupedalism. You may remember humans actually sometimes walk on their palms and their knees, or crawl. And lack knuckle-locking wrists. Sarmiento and Meldrum acknowledged this in the Journal of Comparative Human Biology. Ardipithecus wrist joint is that of a palmograde quadruped. Sanford, in the Annual Review of Anthropology, said much the same.
What is a knuckle-locking wrist? What do the bones look like?
I probably should have researched that so I could give you. The idea is that you can put weight on the knuckles and the wrist doesn't buckle easily, whereas ours is flexible all the way through that. But I'm not sure. It has to do with the pisiform and the, I think the triquetrum, but I'm not sure the exact anatomy.
The bones and not the ligaments.
It has the bone shape actually allows the bones to kind of lock when you put weight on them, so that they don't bend either way. But I'm not sure exactly how that looks. It'd be something to look up one of these days. Conclusion: RD is fully ape. A famous advocate of human evolution, Carl Sagan, once said, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." While the RD team has made extraordinary claims, they have certainly not demonstrated extraordinary evidence. That's an interesting use of that quote. The remains attributed to RD and its kind, Ardipithecus ramidus, do not represent convincing evidence pointing to an early ancestor of man. All of the major features cited by the Discovery team in their attempt to place RD in the direct human lineage are based on highly questionable reconstructions and inferences. In the case of the lumbar spine, completely inferences. The quality of the evidence is itself very poor. The bones were unarticulated and loosely scattered across miles of the Afar landscape and were very poorly preserved. The incomplete, disintegrating, and scattered bone fragments made reconstruction an act of faith. That's a pretty accurate summary there. The original anatomical orientation of key diagnostic bones, particularly the severely crushed skull and hip, were lost forever, too poorly preserved to enable accurate reconstruction. It is no wonder it took nearly 20 years to digitally manipulate the remains to the satisfaction of the discoverers. Many experts in the field have openly questioned RD's actual morphology and true manner of locomotion, and have criticized the speculative reconstructions and inferences derived from them. Leading evolutionary paleo experts have challenged virtually every claim put forth by the Discovery team regarding RD. Detailed criticisms have been reported in numerous peer-reviewed scientific journals, including Science, Nature, Annual Review of Anthropology, and Journal of Comparative Human Biology, as discussed in this chapter. The authors of these papers are respected paleoanthropologists that seem to represent the prevailing view held by the paleo community. In other words, if the authors of this book are correct, Tim White and company are in the distinct minority and would appear to have an axe to grind on this. It is unfortunate that the views of these scientists have not been made widely known to the general public and to students. The competing view that Artie is merely an extinct ape is not mentioned in textbooks. Instead, essentially all textbooks now list Artie as the oldest known human ancestor, arguing that it is another conclusive proof of human evolution. Despite what the discovery team claims, there is no evidence Artie had a human-like hip. There is no evidence Artie had a human-like lower lumbar curvature. There is no evidence Artie's skull and teeth were evolving towards becoming human, because it happens to other non-evolving apes. Artie's anteriorly positioned foramen magnum is very questionable, and even if so, would not warrant its placement in the human lineage. Artie's limb proportions, hands, and feet are unmistakably that of an ape. There is no legitimate evidence to suggest Artie walked upright like humans. The traits presented as evidence that Artie was in the human lineage are the very same features currently seen in living apes, as noted by evolutionary paleo experts, which basically boils down to the teeth. And then of the latest developments in the fall of 2017, remember these people are trying desperately to get a part ape, part human, and now they've got the first ape that kind of is leaning towards human. Artie was dated 4.4 million years old, and in 1992 was announced to the world as the oldest human ancestor. Despite its proposed status as a human ancestor, Artie displayed an overwhelmingly chimp-like anatomy, including a highly divergent grasping big toe, abducted hallux. A new discovery made in 2017 may be the final nail in the coffin for Artie. Anatomically modern human footprints from Western Crete, which we've talked about in the Sabbath School before, further suggest, dated to 5.7 million years old, further suggests that man has always coexisted with the earliest reputed hominins. The anthropology department at Uppsala University, that is Gregor's Niedwiecki, second author of the technical paper, published an article in Science Daily stating at approximately 5.7 million years old, they are more than 1 million years older than Ardipithecus ramidus with its ape-like feet. This conflicts with the hypothesis that Ardipithecus is a direct ancestor of later hominins. You could argue that Lucy had human-like feet and therefore, maybe, although after the last chapter I'd worry about that, but there are the photographs, clearly big toe, clearly abducted, clearly not ape-like, compared with Ardipithecus ramidus, where it is clearly more chimp-like, made for grabbing. How you get that from an Artie is really not explainable. Now, my take on it, the chapter makes a convincing argument that Ardipithecus ramidus, I know what happened, autocorrection. Ardipithecus ramidus is an ape. They seem to have ape-like characteristics. One can use them as primitive hominins with many ape-like features. But they are close to other apes, close enough, I think, in my opinion anyway, to have descended from them. And you remember the Bush theory of human evolution. The Bush theory of evolution is okay, but we need to have a main stem, at least one. Could be 2 or 3, but at least one. Common descent requires that some population had continuous ancestor-descendant relationships between the apes and humans. And a conventional story, starting with Darwin, is a nice line. That's the ape-to-human march that you've seen drawn, with presumably the chimpanzees staying the same or perhaps changing a little bit. You could have branching that eventually fuses. You could have several other branches along the way that stayed for a while. You can have the Stephen Jay Gould where it suddenly popped up. What you can't do is have that kind of branching together. That requires, if you have common descent, a previous ancestor that we just haven't found. If that's gone, you don't have evidence for common descent. At least not physical evidence for common descent. Now remember, we've been looking at Neanderthal, which can either be placed up here or can be placed there. In terms of cranial capacity, they actually exceed other humans. You can have Homo erectus, which can be placed in either place. You can have Homo floresiensis, which can be, I think, probably best put as a variant of Homo erectus. But if Homo erectus is human, then that means it's a variant of human. You can have Australopithecus. You can put it partway up the tree, although, again, it's probably actually lower than that. Or you can put it on the bush of apes. You can take Ardipithecus and put it there, or you can put Ardipithecus in a two-way tree. But you'll notice that there is a large gap between the apes and the humans. And that's where we're building. Now the question is, can Homo habilis or Homo naledi or Homo sediba fill that gap? If not, we're looking at a tree. And so next time we'll be talking about the supposed intermediate species. But that's my opinion. Now it's your turn. Go ahead.
You sit and wonder why in the world they were able to make a separate genus out of this thing on such scant evidence of, are there any other bones than just this one thing they've put together?
Well,
or there's
if I read the story correctly, there's another whole genus or another whole species made up of some other bones of the same general kind of thing, which but those are much more fragmentary. It's you know, a few finger bones and stuff. You know, it's you name a new species, you get your name attached to it.
And new genus.
A new genus, you get your name attached, I guess. To me, trying to, you know, the ability to say that this could not interbreed with chimpanzees is just bizarre.
Or at least with other Australopithecines.
Yeah. This is splitting gone wild. You know, I'm surprised these guys don't do, you know, Homo africanus and Homo europeanus and, you know, Homo pekingensis or something.
You might as well make a new genus out of each one of these. You really do a good job.
Yeah. You know, it is sobering to think what they would do with various buried dogs. Dachshund, Chihuahua, English Boxer, Great Dane, German Shepherd. You know, and Darwin himself was a pigeon breeder.
Talk about faith. I mean, you really have to exert a lot of faith here to
Oh yeah.
go down this pathway.
Now, I will have to say that when you present it this way, it sounds kind of a little bit on the absurd side. But I will also have to say that if you start knowing that humans are descended from a chimp-like ancestor,
And
then they reverse that and they say, there must have been an ancestor. I think we found it.
Mm-hmm.
How can you say that we didn't?
Oh, this is the dominance of the paradigm.
Exactly. Yes?
It's amazing that these bone fragments were found scattered over a 4-mile area. That's like picking up little bone fragments from here all the way over to Redlands.
Yeah, that's what it is. And be assured that they were all part of the same animal. You know, at this point, it boggles the imagination.
Yeah, I think the understanding is what you mentioned earlier. These folks, they're sure that man evolved from apes, and that is not the question they're asking.
Yeah. The question they're asking is, could this be
An intermediate.
an intermediate?
Not-
And so you are allowed to reconstruct it according to how you envisioned. You know, this reminds one of the Piltdown Man controversy, and Piltdown Man, of course, was destroyed when people realized that the standard evolution model should not be that you have a big brain case and then you have the jaw modernized, that really the jaw should modernize first, and then Piltdown Man didn't fit the paradigm anymore. And then people started looking at it more closely, and it was required that they look at it more closely, and when they did, they discovered the fraud. Science apparently corrects itself when the paradigm can shift.
Sometimes, if you ask the right questions.
Well, I would maintain that maybe if the paradigm shifted away from an anti-biblical agenda, that maybe the science would shift again, and it might be even a better shift. But, you know, I guess we'll see how that works. Yes?
Can you go back to the previous slide in the upper right-hand one? I'm not quite sure about the divergence and then converging.
Sure. Let's see, this is what you wanted, right?
Yeah, and then keep going until...
Okay, so we'll just... there?
Yeah, so the upper right-hand one, so, I mean, can you sort of describe that? That would be...
This is the more popular way of describing it now. Although there are people who say we don't actually have any animals along this area here. All we have are the Neanderthal, which is up here, the Homo erectus, which is up here. Let's put those in. And the Homo floresiensis, which is up there. And then we have the Australopithecines, and we have the Ardipithecines.
Well, I'm totally confused about the diagram. So, sorry, so is that describing an original ancestor that branched into two branches, but then later they interbred?
Yeah.
And why? But yeah, during the divergence, there were species that diverged off those.
Right, right. So you had one species that branched off this one, and maybe another one that branched off that one. The problem is, of course, that those species have to survive long enough to leave ancestors.
Why the need to diverge and then reconverge genetically?
Because they interbred. That apparently happened with Neanderthals and humans. That what happened is the Neanderthals didn't die out, they just got absorbed. Maybe, well, you know, obviously they did die out in one sense.
Well, we don't have them today.
That they all died, but then you kind of expect that. But the idea is that the genetic material didn't just disappear, it actually, some of it anyway, got interweaved into European and Asian populations.
So what's the lime green line, and why doesn't it start with any previous species?
Well, the lime green line is actually Homo erectus. The thing of it is, Homo erectus is pretty close to human. And so it needs to be placed close to that. One can argue that it diverged in some ways.
So in the diagram below, it's actually coming off the horizontal upper line. Go up, 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 down, there. So it actually starts from a species.
That could start from the human species, which had carried through the whole time.
Okay, but in the upper diagram, the upper and outer curve, is that human? The curved line?
No, this is an entirely imaginary curve.
Okay, but the lime green line is not even coming off of that one, apparently.
Well, that's right, and I've done that deliberately because Homo erectus goes back a million years, and so really what you should have is this line has to get up to there in order to make it work. I mean, it's starting to look like the Gould hypothesis.
I suspect that all this interbreeding that's documented and inferred is what has been previously referred to as amalgamation. And I have another comment. This kind of illustrates the source of some criticisms against creationists. For instance, all these guys who are saying that white has it all wrong, those could be quoted and say, well, see, they're obviously not agreeing with the evolution. But actually they are. They're fully convinced that humans evolved. It's just that they're disagreeing with these specific interpretations. So we have to be careful about that.
That is correct. And we need to be careful, that's a strength and a weakness. And I think if you say it openly, I think the weakness is mitigated and the strength is made stronger. And that is, these people are sure there must be ape to man ancestors. Whether they go gradually or divergently or rapidly, you can argue about that. But they're sure that somewhere there is a line that goes up. Now, what's happening is with the 5.7 million year old footprints, it looks like they're reduced to having it go up fast before 5.7 million years. And that's a criticism of the theory itself. One that I think before the discovery of the footprints in Crete, most of them would have said, no, that's obviously incorrect. It's just, they're there, we just haven't found them yet. But yeah, we can quote them. They're doing admissions against evidence. In other words, what we're saying is that they agree that there was an evolutionary ancestor. They're just saying that Lucy or Neanderthals aren't part of it. I think they would still insist that Homo erectus was going on the way up. And some of them will say, well, really, Australopithecus belongs with the ape group. And they would say, well, it's a side branch, but they still believe that there was an evolution somewhere along here. It's just that we haven't found it yet. So what it boils down to is you're kind of taking that on faith. And I think that one should not try to simply destroy that faith. One should simply let it sit for what it is. And if you really need it, okay, I'm not, you know, who am I to tell you you can't believe that? But I think it is fair to say, who are you to tell me that I can't believe that it looks more like two branching trees that don't actually have a root together? And it's perfectly reasonable to look at all this stuff and say it's not together. Now, I will have to say one other thing, and that is that there have been hypotheses that, for example, because of some of the features, that there were actual human chimpanzee, human gorilla crossbreeds, and that they account for the fact that gorillas have a sagittal crest and some of these creatures have sagittal crests, but they seem to have some human characteristics. That is a creationist hypothesis, and I think before we have data, it's a reasonable one. These people are making the case that once we have the data, it's not required, and in fact, it may not be appropriate. So when we look at the intermediate species that we're going to look at next, there'll be 3 more of them, look carefully at how they're dealing with it. And ask yourself, do they make the case adequately that there are no human-chimp intermediates? And, you know, it's too bad that Lee Spencer is no longer around. It would be nice to have him give a talk on you know, whether we can have this kind of fusion or not, and what kind of evidence there is for it, because I think that there may be some evidence that that their reconstruction isn't complete. But as you can see, some of this stuff, and I think this particular chapter, when you start saying that the pelvis was human but it's all crushed, the skull was human but it's all crushed, the teeth are human but it's sort of like some other teeth that we've seen in other apes, at that point, the argument that Ardipithecus is on the way towards becoming human gets weak. And then when we have human footprints in Crete that are clearly not Ardi footprints, it gets really weak.
Do you
Go ahead.
Do you happen to know what dating method they use for that 5.7?
Yes. We actually went over that briefly. There is a layer that is geologically dated as to when the Mediterranean dried up, the salinity crisis. And I do believe the Mediterranean did dry up somehow, because the Straits of Gibraltar are carved in such a way that it looks like there was a catastrophic flooding. The same way that the Bosporus and Dardanelles have the same features. If the Mediterranean carved, then it must have been some room for water to flow into it. Now, whether it completely dried up or whether it was just way down, it's not clear. But it was down far enough so that the Nile River carved a canyon down into it. So
we We carve canyons underwater all the time from the continental shelf.
Well, okay, there are canyons that are carved into the continental shelf. I'm not sure that you can say that those are being carved right now. I suspect that some of them were done when the continental shelf was a little lower. But your mileage may vary. It'll be interesting to see what happens. See, one of the things that I think the only way you can carve something like that underwater in a physical manner is to have whatever is running the water into it have heavier water than usual, which could happen if you've got a lot of sediment coming off.
Monterey Canyon up here near Monterey Bay.
Yeah.
Is a mile deep. You'd have to have really low water for that one. Sediment can carve. Water can carve underwater as well as it can under air if it's moving.
Yeah, if it's moving in particular directions. Monterey Canyon is a reasonable argument for underwater carving. You know, it's too bad we don't have a three-dimensional video that we can go back and look. Be interesting to ask, maybe someday we will. What will we find?
I have a theory about these researchers who are spending thousands of hours to put this skull together and the hips together, at whose expense? Maybe the theory is that maybe they paid someone millions of years ago to crush the hip and spread it all over from here to Redlands. And so that now these folk have a job, you know, and be paid.
The Lord works in mysterious ways.
We give him credit sometimes too much, sir. But, you know, and then I think it was Harry Reid who says, absence of proof is not a proof of its absence.
Yes.
So, therefore, we are paying people, the taxpayers, all the scientists all over. So why don't the creationists also get their voice? Why shouldn't also they be supported by the taxpayer to
because
defend
that's
their
religion? This is science. Don't ask. Yes, comment over here.
Well, there's some ancient maps that suggest that at one time the ocean water level was lower than it is now. There's evidence of buildings and even underwater pyramids that were evidently erected on dry land at one time that are now underwater. So there's evidence that the water level and the sea level was lower than it is at the present time, so that some of these things like the Mediterranean could very well have been a dry area when the water level was lower, and the Nile River would have carved out of the solid dry land its river pattern, and it's now filled in with water when the water rushed back in and filled in the Mediterranean. There's also evidence of the area between England and Holland, that at one time that area was was dry land, and they have evidence that there were fields and farming going on there in what is now considered the banks. But there's evidence of geology evidence underwater now that was dry land and had farms at one time.
I'm not familiar with all of that evidence. I am familiar with the fact that there are streamlined islands submerged now in the English Channel, leading most people to believe that the English Channel was carved by a release of massive floodwaters, usually thought to be at the end of the Ice Age. So a lot of things have happened. I think that our best bet in this kind of thing is to be as open as we can with the evidence. These guys are making an argument. We'll see how good it is.
With a bit of tongue in cheek, can I ask one question? How come they haven't linked Lucy to these wonderful feet and hands? It's only 57 miles apart. So obviously what happened to Lucy was she was killed, her feet and hands were cut off, which they still do in some parts of the jungles, and then they went to roast her 57 miles away. I mean, you know, all you need to do is apply a bit of imagination, and you can have lots of fun. The other thing that worries me about the English Channel theory is I live in a part of Europe where the ground is rising all the time. It's been rising for several thousands of years. Our economic capital has changed in Finland 3 times, and they finally abandoned it because it was too far away from the ports. And in one little town I lived in, the port has changed 5 times because the ground just keeps rising. So we know that there are phenomenal turbulences on this planet, on this globe. And rocks and things which we as children thought were nice and solid are actually not solid. They hold vast amounts of water, and they are plastic, I guess is one way of putting it. Mm-hmm. So the one thing would be if we just had more money and more time, we could do a lot more research and we could have a lot of fun.
Yes. Well, of course, there's 2 questions. One of them is, do we have, can we do research without spending all that money? And we worked on some of that, but found quite a bit. But the other question is, maybe with the application of a little bit more money, and it's probably not going to come from the government because the government is run by people who know that the Earth is millions of years old. It's probably going to have to come from our own ranks. But, you know, do you really want to spend $1 million to do something? Or maybe 5 million? You know, you have to be pretty sure of your target before you're going to spend that kind of money. You know, it always amuses me of the people who say from the other side that, oh, but they've been spending millions of dollars. Ariel Roth laughs. Yeah. Yeah. Well, not only that, but most of that money was spent on buildings and people's salaries, not on actual research projects. Not that library research isn't a good idea, but there is a limit to what you can do if you don't have access to, you know, if you're going to do carbon-14 dating, you really need access to a machine. And sometimes that's granted and sometimes that's not. And as time is going on and we start doing more interesting, in my opinion, research, access to machines has been drying up. I think partly because they realize where this is going and they don't want to be any part of it for various reasons. But we'll see what happens. Anyway, I think that Ardi is probably the clearest argument of all. Really, there's nothing human about Ardi except for maybe the teeth, which again can be found in apes, and the reconstruction of the pelvis and the cranium, which the part of the cranium they want to reconstruct isn't even there. And the pelvis is really, really shaky, and the lumbar spine is just gone. You know, the question I have is how many students have been told, well, what are you going to do about Artie, huh? Huh? It is amazing.
How many Adventist
Go ahead.
kids, not only here, but all over the world, are losing their faith on false claims like this. It's sobering.
Yeah, it is.
It is sobering because don't think that they watch National Geographic only here. It's watched all over the world.
Well, this is the reason why we're doing this today, because nobody else is doing it.
Nobody else is doing it.
And, you know, my hat is off to Chris Rupe and John Sanford for going back to the basics and looking at it. You know, one can criticize them here or there in little tiny places, but, you know, their major stuff, I think, is valid, and I think that it is valid for us every time we are tempted to say, oh, there's just so much evidence, to say, wait a minute, is it this quality of evidence? If it is, why are we giving our birthright away to mesopottage?
Shortly before November 8th election, I went and I was invited to speak at Sanford, high school about marijuana. And these kids were stunned. And just, please come back, speak to us again. They gave me dates to go and speak. These are high school kids. So when you give them convincing medical data, their jaws hang loose. Well, the election happened, and it was proposal, whatever, to legalize marijuana here and it's over. I never got a call from them, from the school, because I think teachers felt that we should not talk about it anymore or whatever.
Which
it's
is
horrible.
a little crazy. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah, they were, but I think they got scared or whatever. They never called me back. You see, it's horrible what people are not being taught and what's being tolerated. It's not only here, it's all over the world, but it's very, very sad. Truth, you cannot speak truth anymore, and I just gave you an example.
Yeah. Anyway, come back next week. We'll deal with some of the intermediates.